Hello everyone, welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor, I'm a composer, and this is episode number 5. My guest for this episode is Garrett Hope. Before we begin, I need to ask you a favor. Can you please go to iTunes, and if you enjoy this podcast, please give it a rating. This will help spread the word about the show and bring it to more listeners. Hi, Garrett. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself.
I'd be happy to. Hi, Mark. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
Well, I'm happy to have you. I'm going to tell everyone up front that you have a podcast called The Portfolio Composer that I've been listening to, for 2 years and 120 episodes now.
Oh, gosh. 131 as of yesterday.
I've listened to them since just after you began. I found it, I've been listening to podcasts for years, but yours was the first music podcast that I really sort of attached onto. And after listening to yours and another podcast by Andrew Hitz called The Entrepreneur Musician, you're really the two who inspired me to do this.
Oh, well, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really appreciate what you do. And so I'm going to just tell everyone you're a bassist by your training. And so we're going to – I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yes, I am. So my story is a little convoluted because kind of my origin story here, I grew up in a very musical household, and my mother was an elementary school music educator. So music was a priority in my family, and education was a priority. And when I was about 5, my parents signed me up for piano lessons from my aunt. So they thought firmly and rightly that learning piano is a valuable skill. It'll help me learn how to read music in both clefs and give me lifelong facility on this fantastic instrument. When it was time for me to pick a band instrument, I think it was in 3rd grade in the district I grew up in, I wanted to choose saxophone, and my mother, who grew up as a clarinetist, was like, no, you're going to choose a real orchestral instrument, which just kills me she says that. But they already had a clarinet in the house, so I stayed with a single reed, and I started studying clarinet. And I played clarinet all through elementary, middle school, high school, and even at the university. And I loved it. But when I was in middle school, I started taking lessons on guitar, and I felt like I had found my tribe. I was motivated to practice, and I started university as a guitar major, but by the end of my freshman year, I had switched to bass, and I ended up graduating as a bass major.
I didn't know that you played the clarinet.
Yeah.
131 episodes of your show, and I don't think that's ever come out.
Well, it's one of those things that I'm not very proud of. Actually, that's not true. I love that I played clarinet. And in fact, I still am. I'm currently renting a bass clarinet from the university because I'm scoring a movie, and it's this demon possession film. And I thought, ooh, I can make bass clarinet really creepy. So I'm playing a lot of clarinet right now.
Oh, that's awesome. I was going to say, this is a band podcast, Garrett. We don't want to throw shade on the band instruments.
Oh, I know. I'm just kind of poking the bear. I actually, growing up playing in band was one of the highlights of my musical experience. And a lot of my formative music educators came from band world, meaning the people who inspired me the most. And then singing in high school chorus as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of your work, what would you kind of call it? I mean, what ensembles is the bulk of your work for? As
a composer?
Yes.
Oh, chamber music primarily. I've had a lot of success with my choral work, but right now I'm focusing heavily on writing for educational instrumental ensembles, primarily the band. This last year, just like you, Mark, I had a Composers in Schools and Concert Consortium commission. This was for a high school band piece, and that will receive its premiere here in just a few weeks. And I also, this year, wrote a piece for a grade 3 string ensemble. And so I am building my catalog here. I'm really interested in helping music educators get their kids involved and provide meaningful musical experiences. I don't have any expectation that these students are go on to become music majors, but I believe that music is transformative, and I want to help the music educators meet their goals in the classroom and let these kids really fall in love with music.
I have a couple questions that come off of that, but the one that sort of jumps off the page at me is, so you talk about transformative musical experiences. What were your experiences at sort of that educational, that middle school, high school? Were there directors? Were there pieces? Were there composers? What sort of transformed you at that age?
A lot of it had to do with the experience of being in the ensemble, less than the director. And that might be related. I mean, my elementary and middle school band directors were pretty good. My high school band director actually got let go by the district a year or two after I graduated because he wasn't really doing his job. But playing music that was communicating something and meant something to me and my peers is really where the value was for me. And knowing that I was doing something important. I've had the experience of playing through a large part of the canon that we have in band literature, especially once I got into university. And that band director, absolutely, I loved him and influenced me as a person and as a musician. I mean, playing through the Holt Suite and all the, the Granger, all the major staples. And there are moments of those pieces that stick out to me, but it was really just being part of something bigger than myself.
For kids, it is their end musical experience. The high school band is the highest they're going to get to.
Yeah.
And it's very important that we treat them with the dignity and the respect and give them that experience, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So now you mentioned that you started in chamber music, and I know that you're a very successful choral composer. You have some beautiful choral works.
Thank you.
So why instrumental music now?
Well, a number of reasons. For one, it's very exciting to be a part of the band world. Band directors are fun people to be around. And honestly, don't tell the choir people this, but there's a whole lot less drama. And I think there's an excitement about new music. There's a passion for working with composers, which as a composer, you don't typically get with a lot of the major ensembles and genres. And there's a willingness to experiment. I think part of that is because the form of the ensemble itself is still fairly young, right? We're working on 150 years or something of this kind of formalized ensemble. And there is a canon and there is literature, but there is still a willingness to try new things and to continue to add to that. And I love being part of that. Again, it's being in something bigger than myself. And I think making an impact. And I also then, part of the reason I'm excited about focusing on instrumental educational ensembles is the opportunity to work with students at heart. And as I've learned who I really am as a person, I'm an educator. I'm a mentor. I love helping students figure out who they are and what they want to do in the world.
Yeah.
I'm really passionate about it. And you and I have spoken at length about this at other times, about who we are in education, especially higher education, which we don't need to go into here. But that passion I have for teaching, because I'm no longer pursuing academic jobs, I'm transferring into roles like this and helping composers mature, helping students, but standing alongside teachers, because I don't think the composer should come in the classroom and then tell the directors what should be happening. I want to come along and stand next to the director and say, how can I help you with your goals?
Yeah, it is interesting, the idea of working with kids and teaching. I love the college students that I teach. I value that experience with them. But there's something really special about the visceral reaction of a middle schooler when they play a piece of music and they're so excited.
Yeah.
And they come up and say, "Oh, I loved your piece," and there's an enthusiasm that's infectious, and it really sort of energizes you and kind of like it makes it easier to write the next piece, at least for me anyway.
Yeah, it does for me too.
So do you want to talk more about the clinics and the adjudicate, or do you do any of that sort of things?
I do. I've done school visits, especially, in person and Skype, but mainly as Skype rehearsals or clinicking with people who are working on my music, coming in and helping shape the piece and clarify what my vision is for how the musical expression should happen. And I'm always just very careful. I don't want to ever step on a director's toes. And one of the things I've learned is trying to give direction through the conductor.
It's tricky on Skype for sure.
It is really, it's hard, especially when there's a significant lag in the discussion.
Yep.
You can't conduct, unfortunately, so you just have to listen and comment. And often the microphone setup is not ideal, but you can still get a pretty good idea of how they're expressing the music.
Yeah, it usually is issues for me. It seems like I have the most success when we're dealing with issues of phrasing, playing musically. You can't. It's hard to deal with the technical stuff. Plus, again, as you mentioned, you want to be careful that you're not. You don't know how you're taken over the internet.
Yes.
As opposed to in person, it's tricky for sure.
Yeah.
Now, this is a topic that is sensitive, but how about fees? And how do you kind of, if a director were to email you and say, Garrett, I'm doing your work, could you Skype with my band? What does that look like then?
Well, it's a sliding scale. I mean, I want to make this happen, so I'm more than happy to work with the directors and the resources they have available. But this is also how I make my living, and it's my business. And so I think just being honest up front and saying, I mean, I do have a fee. If for the schools that have commissioned me, I wrap those Skype rehearsals into the commission fee.
Sure.
Because I think it's really important to provide that extra value and the face time with the students.
I agree.
But if someone wanted to contact me for a piece that they're doing that they may have purchased the score for, I'm more than happy to do that. And I would just work with them to see what we could do.
Yeah, it's always a delicate balance, isn't it? I found that most of the time, if I'm approached to do an appearance, that the fee is offered up front. I've rarely had to ask. And so that's helpful.
And that's another thing that I think is a strong quality, a good quality of the band community, because almost every band director I've met values the resource that the composer can provide. And though they may not have the budget, they recognize the need to pay for the time for clinicians, for composers. It's not usually an issue. It's just of desire or willingness. It's often just how much money is available.
Yeah, sure. And like you said, I don't know if you listened to my interview with Scott Watson, but we talked about how he has creative ways. He works with the schools to help them raise the funds. And he's been an educator for a very long time. He has some very good ways of doing that. And so that's another possibility, is that you can work with the school to raise that money in various ways.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm happy to explore that. Yeah.
So while we're there, let's talk about commissions. And you already mentioned the Composers and Schools in Concert commission that we both have experienced, and you've had a couple of them. But let's talk about consortiums and specifically CSIC and how that works.
Well, for those who don't know, CSIC is a nonprofit organization that exists to help, again, to provide musical experiences for students. They focus, I think, right now on high schools. But the idea is to provide these consortiums that include multiple Skype or in-person visits with a fairly low buy-in for each school. And by reducing the buy-in, you can get more schools into the consortium, because it's taking the burden of a full commission is really hard for most schools.
It is.
And often a buy-in can be an entire year's music budget. But if you think creatively and you work with your band boosters programs, there's ways to do this. And I think what's important, and CSIC does a really good job with this, is showing that there is more value in the whole process than just having the music in a performance, because there's interaction with the students. For me, I meet with them in the fall and want to know who they are. What are they interested in? What do they like playing? What were the pieces that meant a lot to them? And I'll allow them to put input into the music. And then when they get the score and they're working through it and rehearsing, it's still a dialogue. So it's not a fixed piece. And this last spring, working through this most recent one, I've been able to make some really good changes based on the feedback from the students. And
it's such a better experience to be there in the rehearsals with the students and sort of have them have some input. There's the usual sort of teenage skepticism, at first, which I found, which was pretty funny actually, but that's another podcast, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's such a good experience for the students to see a composer, to see them living and breathing and not just a name on the paper.
Yes. Yeah.
I got so many questions. There were less questions about like the piece and how to play it, and most of the questions were like, how do you come up with ideas? How do you write it down? What software to use? So that's telling me that there's interest in the students, that they want to be creative too, and that's exciting.
Yeah. And I part of what I've been doing lately, and this is a tip I got from Alex Shapiro, bless her heart, is when I'm interacting, ask the students, which of you or who of you are organizing sound in any way? Are you writing songs? Are you composing? And that opens up a whole new level of the dialogue, because you can talk to them on a new level. It's not just, I like pieces that make me feel like this or sound like that. You can now say, well, when I'm organizing the sounds, this is how I'm thinking. And you can talk about the elements of music, form, texture, harmony, melody, all that stuff.
Absolutely.
I think in an even more rich level.
Yeah. So, in the state of Illinois, they have the NAFME has the composition contests at the different grade levels for the students.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're in Nebraska. I don't know if Nebraska does that. But do you have any advice for band directors, choir directors, orchestra directors who have students who are interested in composition? I mean, what might you tell them to help their students?
For the band directors that feel a little bit of anxiety on trying to help a student write music because you may not write or arrange yourself, I think the best thing to do is to have the student listen to exemplars in the kind of style that they're listening to, no matter what that is. If they're writing an EDM piece or a string ensemble piece or a band piece, and help them to analyze the score a little bit so they can see how composers are doing things. And you don't have to go deep, and they don't have to do a chord analysis, but just say, where are the most important things? What are you hearing in these sections? And then help them to grasp the idea that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. If a composer's doing something and they like the way that sounds, you can take that idea and make it your own.
Yeah, this is interesting because even as a composer I consider myself mid-career, I've had some success. When I start a new piece of music, it's often I often model it after another piece and then sort of evolve into my own style over time. It's that idea of not starting from something new. And that's just a trick I've sort of picked up over the years. And I wish someone had told me that when I was 18.
Oh, me too. And the one piece of advice I could give myself if I would turn back the clock is that I don't need someone's permission to make the music I want to make.
Right.
And I think telling your students and the young composers in your life that is great, because often we're waiting for the authorities or the gatekeepers to say, hey, you're a composer now, instead of encouraging them to experiment and try. And not all experiments are going to be successful, but they're doing it. But I think one of the biggest things that young composers struggle with is form. Starting a piece and having a structure that makes sense, that stays just long enough to complete an idea but doesn't get boring and then moves to something else.
It's not only young composers that struggle with form. It is still the most difficult part of composition for me.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard.
It is. We all have our things, I guess, but that's mine. All right, Garrett, so what advice would you give to band directors or conductors who are interested in commissioning work from you, or for anyone else for that matter?
I think the first thing is to not be afraid to approach composers, no matter what the budget situation looks like, because most composers are willing to work with you because they're more interested in making it happen than not. Secondly, what I've found helpful is to be willing to have a frank dialogue about the strengths and weaknesses of your ensemble. And part of that is because you could say, my piece or my high school, we play a lot of grade 3s or grade 4s. But that is so nebulous, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what exactly does that mean. So if I'm talking to a school in New York, is going to be different than a school in Nebraska, is going to be different from a school in Texas.
Sure.
And so saying specific pieces, this is what we can do really well, this is a stretch for us, and then being able to say, this year or the year we're going to play this piece, this section is my strongest section, this is my weakest section, these are my all-state players, and that gives the composer a really good idea of how they can use the resources that you have in your room and in your ensemble most effectively.
All right, so that leads me to the next question.
Okay.
So now we are looking for more than one performance, especially if you're writing music for instrumental ensembles. So if you write the piece too specifically to a school, do you run the risk of having just the piece be pigeonholed for that one performance, that one ensemble?
There's always that risk, I think, Mark. But we have these ideal ensembles in our head, and a full range of colors. And if we take University of Texas, right, as this example, right now, this probably one of the premier university wind ensembles, that'd be great if we could do that. But not all high school and middle school band directors have those resources in their room.
No, certainly not.
So I think when you write a piece that's tailored to one group, I think there are things the composer can do, and maybe after the premiere can go back and make small score revisions so it's more broadly appealing. The trick, though, is personally I want to avoid any sense of block scoring and that kind of generic brown band sound. I don't want that. And that's what happens when you're just writing SATB in all the choirs and
right,
too many doublings. So
right.
I don't really know what the answer is. I think there's each piece has its own kind of knife edge of a balancing act that you have to walk.
Right, and I think that's probably the right approach too. I think, if you get caught up trying to write for an audience rather than writing your music, then that's sort of a path to being lost.
Yes, very much.
As a composer. And so I think you have to write your music first. But this leads me to the next question I was going to ask you is about, are you self-published or commercially published? And specifically the idea of commercial publication in the band market. You have interviewed Brian Balmages,
yes,
and I know you've had Chris Bernatus is coming on
He
soon.
is, very soon. Yep.
And I know that there's a few other names there. And I know that you've also interviewed David Maslenka, who takes the other approach, the self-published approach.
Yes.
And so maybe we can dig into this a little bit. And so how about you? Are you self-published or commercially published?
I am self-published, 100%. When I started writing music, quote unquote, professionally as an undergrad, I just chose to do that because I wanted to control everything. And I liked the idea of getting more than just 10% of sales. There is some cachet to being published with a traditional publisher, and that can help you cut through the noise a little bit. But what we're seeing in the traditional publishing market is that a lot of these publishers, they only really promote their biggest selling pieces. They can have huge catalogs. Like you look at Alfred or Hal Leonard, and the whole company is supported on probably 10 to 20% of everything they have. So you might be in that catalog, but your piece isn't really getting promoted, and you end up having a whole bunch of orphaned works that are no longer for sale, and they're out of print, and the copyright's owned by the publisher, and there's nothing you can do. Yeah.
I am commercially published. I have my fourth and my fifth commercial publications coming out this summer. And that's certainly part of the calculus of the whole thing, right? It's the trade-off to have my piece represented by Barnhouse and Robert W. Smith or by Grand Mesa. How do you cut through that noise? How do you get your name out there in a market that while does welcome new music and is excited about new music is also very crowded?
It is very crowded. This current age we live in and the computer is still changing it all. And I'm a member composer of groups like Music Spoke, so my music is available at musicspoke.com, which is a distribution platform for self-published composers. And I think a lot of band directors are interested in supporting the composer. They would rather the composer be rewarded for their work than not. But again, it's how do they even get to know about your piece without having to spend 6 hours wading through a whole bunch of schlock to get to the gem.
And sure. And, high school band directors are extremely busy. They have a lot on their plate.
Yep.
And I remember when I was in that position, often picking music is done on the side. It's done in an off hour, a couple days a week, and at one point of the year. And it's hard to work through everything. It's hard to find things. And often the recommendations, there's no question that when you sort Pepper's catalog, it's the editor's choice pieces that come to the top of the sales.
Yes.
And, that's just part of the reality. And again, I think... it's interesting. There are lots of composers in the band world who are self-published, who are writing terrific music and having big careers. We know them. We know John Mackey and Stephen Bryant, and we mentioned John Newman and David Maslenka. By the same token, it's just that trade-off.
Right, and I don't think there's a right answer, but one of the things that's really apparent is the old publishing model, which used to work, is no longer sustainable. And that's true whether you're talking about music or you're talking about books or you're talking about movies and CDs.
Yeah.
And as everything shifts, I don't know what the answer is. I think there's some viable predictions of what that could look like. And that's not something I'm interested in solving, but I'm definitely involved. I have a vested interest in what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, my future plans look like trying to live in both worlds, to continue to have pieces commercially published and yet still maintain my catalog on my website of pieces that are self-published.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to do it too. I
think that way you sort of you put your eggs in different baskets that way.
Yeah, you do.
Okay, Garrett, it's such a, maybe we're a little composer-centric with that last segment, but it's such an important topic.
Yeah.
And I will say to band directors that, be willing to check websites of composers. If you see a piece, look at their website. You don't have to go through a publisher necessarily. There might be other pieces there.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about writing a new work. So let's say that a director comes to you and says, Garrett, I'd like to commission you to write a new work. What's your process?
This is good timing because I'm just started this process with a school in Colorado. And so I had this great phone conversation with the director. Again, strengths and weaknesses, what are their interests? This particular piece is being commissioned to honor a student who has, I can't remember the name of this disease, but it's the kind of thing where this student probably won't live to see the age of 30 or 35. And so they want to celebrate this kid. And so there's that in mind. But the process starts with a conversation with the director and building a vision for what they're going to do in that concert and what they want the piece to achieve. And for me, a lot of composition happens just in the thinking process. So I'm entering now this multi-month stage where the ideas are rattling around and they're kind of gestating. And I'm currently working on this film score and a few other small projects. But that whole time I'm thinking about this and kind of forming ideas. So for me, when I'm writing, then the process can be long. And then when I'm sitting down to actually write, it happens very quick because these things have been rolling around in the back of my head and they're ready to burst out. And this has caused me a little bit of conflict with people who've commissioned music because I really want this to be a dialogue. And a lot of composers will work on a piece and send sections, like you get feedback on each section, but I end up writing so fast that I can end up sending a whole piece rather than just a section. And that's something I'm working on, but I still want this to be about feedback, and it's a process.
I work very similarly. I'm writing a piece right now that I'm going to be a little bit late on, unfortunately, due to some personal things. But it's the same thing. I thought I had the piece done, but it wasn't good, and I can't send anything because it's all interrelated. And I kind of binge write.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll go and I'll work on a piece, and for weeks my session will be nothing but sitting at the computer looking at the blinking cursor, maybe playing with things, putting little ideas down and rejecting them, and then one day all those dots on that page seem to start to coalesce into something, and then it just happens.
It just happens. Last month when I was visiting one of the schools in the consortium, in which happened to be in LA, the student asked me, well, how much of the piece did you actually write down the first time? And I thought about it, and I think it's about 20% happens on the first pass. But I still wrote, actually notated the whole piece in less than a week. But I had been composing it for 6 months.
Yeah. And, I sit down at the piano early on in the process too, but even that is just nothing more than guided improvisation.
Yep. Yeah.
Have you ever had the experience where you've come up with a melody and you've written it down, or maybe you've recorded it or something and you rejected it? And
Absolutely.
Then at the end of the day, that becomes the idea that the piece is centered around.
Oh, yeah.
That happens a lot for me.
One of the most influential books I ever read was Stephen King's book on writing, and he calls it a memoir on the craft of writing.
Yeah, I just finished it.
It's so good, and
It's
almost
great.
every page can apply to what I do as a composer.
Yep.
And he speaks a lot about being surprised by characters. And I think what you just described is one of those moments where you write something and you're like, I'm not really sure. And later on, it works. And you're a little surprised by it. Like, oh, this is going in a new direction, and I didn't plan on it.
You know what really strikes me is how he talks about finding the fossil.
Yes.
And the process of writing is sort of uncovering that crucial idea.
Yep.
I thought that was fascinating. That's a wonderful book on creativity.
And he has this great idea too of writing your first draft with the door closed, which for him means not asking for input and not self-editing, because you just need to get it all out. And then with the second draft, now you're thinking critically, like, does this section work here? Has what I written driven the narrative along? And this is all true to how we write music.
It is true. I wish I could be a little less self-critical.
It's hard turning that voice off.
Very difficult. Okay, well, again, we're getting back to talking composition, but I think that's okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. So let's talk about if a piece is graded. So what grade level is the band in Colorado looking for?
A grade 3-ish. That's what they're comfortable with. I think they just did the Granger piece, Lincolnshire Posy, and that was pushing it. So I think they want something that challenges specific skills, has some solo sections, features their strongest players, is challenging but accessible.
That's, to me, grade 3 is the hardest grade to write for, because it's the middle grade. It's the most common. Mm-hmm. And I feel it's hard. It's harder to hit that mark. I feel like it's a narrower slice.
It is. Well, something I've struggled with, and you actually, when I shared my most recent score with you, you had given some really valuable feedback. And one of the things I learned, because I was tailoring this to the unique assets of each school, blending all four together, some sections have harder parts than other sections.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Again, that's the same issue of am I writing for one band or am I writing for a general market? And
Right. There's nothing worse if you have a piece. Well, I won't say there's nothing worse, but it's hard as a director when you have a piece where one section is doing less than the others.
Yeah.
They're kids.
They want to be involved. Yeah.
And they do kid things when they're not.
Yeah.
So do you have a piece kind of in mind? Are you modeling this without giving any specifics? Are you looking at sort of pieces to kind of hit your mark?
It's still too early in the process to say, but as time progresses, I'll begin listening more and more to pieces that I think are expressing what I want to express.
Yeah.
This particular student they want to honor has a very jovial nature, and he's a prankster, and so they want this fun and kind of humorous piece. But there also needs to be some seriousness to it. I mean, they don't want to write a lacrimosa or an in memoriam.
Oh, yeah, no.
But there's a recognition that this is a heavy thing. And so I'm trying to find where that balancing act is going to be. And they don't want a multi-movement work. So maybe a single movement in kind of an ABA structure with a more meditative internal section, I think might be appropriate, balanced by the joy that this kid has for just being alive and his friends.
Yeah, that's a tricky balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you're up to the challenge, Garrett. I'm looking forward to hearing the result.
No, thank you.
So what general advice would you give to young composers, and especially young composers who are interested in writing for band, or in your case for any educational ensemble, choir or orchestra, since you've done all three?
Oh, for the composers, make sure you're playing or singing. Like, I grew up playing clarinet, so I feel that I have a pretty good handle of how to write phrasing that works. Mm-hmm. Especially for the reed instruments. I wish I had a better understanding of brass instruments, and then moving to strings, I have really understand how they work, because
right.
Moving into the orchestral literature as a college student, I was in a better position to study that. And I would encourage these young composers to score study as well and listen. And when you're playing a piece in your high school group or your middle school group, listen across the band.
Right.
But the value in that for composers is to really hear how your piece fits in. Where's the counterpoint happening? Are you an internal supporting line, or are you playing melody or bass? How is it moving around? What's the rhythmic interplay? And without listening, that's not going to happen.
I think so. I think there's such value in sitting in an ensemble. Even if you don't play the instrument, going to a rehearsal and sitting in the middle and asking if you can just be there.
Yeah.
Understanding balance and understanding, more importantly, blend and how the wind instruments work together. Yeah, I think it's of vital importance. And I would also add they need to listen to your show.
Oh, well, thank you. I would love it if they did. My show is focused more, the Portfolio Composer is focused on the business end of writing music, because I believe we are all business owners in this new gig-based economy, and we want to make art and we want to make a connection and say something that's important, but we also need to buy food and pay the mortgage down and student loans and everything else. And how do we do that?
Your show's terrific, and it is centered on the business of being a composer, but it also, composers touch on all these vital issues. It's not just that. So it's a far greater resource than just that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That means a lot to me.
So one of my stock questions, which I stole from you, is what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self? But you already answered it.
I did. Yeah. Don't wait for permission. Another piece of advice I could give to myself is not to worry. I used to worry about the future, and I still do a little bit.
Yeah.
I think there's no value in doing that, and that's something I could have learned a lot earlier.
I don't know how to get over the not worrying part.
I don't either. It doesn't matter what kind of faith you believe in, or if you don't at all, but all ancient literature and faiths say, you know what? Worrying doesn't do anything for you. And as a musician, being anxious about getting the next gig or being anxious about the performance and the premiere, I think that hampers our ability to write and then perform with the joy of being alive. Often when I'm at a performance of my music, I'm just so happy that people are playing my music that it's even hard for me to be critical. And I hear stories about composers like Stockhausen who would sit there with a scowl on his face and then criticize them because they missed one, embedded rhythm somewhere. And I don't want to be that guy. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy to be making music. I don't want to be worried about it.
I know. I do this because I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, I love music. I love getting up in the morning and being a composer, being a musician. If that's not why I'm doing this, then I need to not do it.
Yeah.
So anyway, so what's your favorite work for wind ensemble or band?
The piece that I loved the most was Russian Christmas music. Man, I had a hard time saying that. And partly because I was playing double bass in the ensemble at that time, and there's that great walking bass line right in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
But that was also a piece that I thought was really colorful and explores. It's kind of a fantasia on a really limited theme. I just loved it. I loved being in it. I loved playing it. I got to perform it twice over my time at university, and that piece in particular really stands out.
Mm-hmm. That's a great piece. So, Garrett, what's coming up that you want to share or promote?
Oh, well, this new piece I'm doing for the school in Colorado, which is a single school commission, but I'm always open to speaking with directors and, like I said earlier, helping directors meet their needs, their pedagogical goals. Every school has a unique set of desires and students, and so you have to tailor what's happening to them. And I think as much as it's important to teach the students the important works in the canon, it's also important to be pushing the genre forward. And so I'm kind of getting off your question, but I'm just excited to talk to directors. I'm excited to continue doing this. And I'm growing my podcast a lot and helping composers to get out in the world and share their music too.
Well, I think you're doing terrific work.
Thank you.
So how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I can be reached at Garrett, 2 R's, 2 T's, at GarrettHope.com. And that's also my personal website where you can go and explore my music. I need to do a better job of getting my wind ensemble music up there right now. But you can learn more about my podcast as well if you go to theportfoliocomposer.com. And I love interviewing directors. And so if you're a director and you're out and you're a part of commissioning a lot of music, I actually want to talk to you for the podcast and figure out how can composers do this better.
Great, Garrett. Any last minute words of wisdom?
What was valuable to me as a student was knowing that my directors were passionate about the music. And when I'm teaching, I go out of my way to show my students that I really like what I'm doing and I love this music. And I think if we demonstrate that, that helps the students with buy-in and falling in love with it as well. Again, no expectations that they're going to become professional musicians or music majors, but music is something that they can do for the rest of their lives. So show them how much you love what you're doing.
Excellent, Garrett. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. My pleasure.